it's not settled yet. This regional urbanization process is what I've been talking about as a shift, a sea change from the metropolitan model into something. All of us here, when we think of cities, big cities, we have a metropolitan model in our mind, that there's an inner core, usually one dominant inner core, which gives a name to everything. And it's dense and it's heterogeneous and it's exciting and it's got drugs and crime and museums and theaters and all kinds of exciting, dramatic things. That's the city. And then there's sleepy, suburb, green, lots of automobiles and women using appliances in the house to save their labor, and men being the predominant breadwinners and sort of nuclear families living out in the healthy. You know, the books in urban studies could be divided into the two libraries, two completely different libraries. This dualistic form that was characteristic of the modern metropolis. And if you looked at the density gradient, you had a steep one at first in the city that the geographers really loved. You know, I remember the quantitative mathematical geographers desperately looking to see if they can find the coefficient of the decline of the inner city density gradient. You know, if we could just find that, my goodness, we have a fantastic physical theory of the city. And then it would sort of sprawl outward, you know, low density sprawling, which we called stupid growth instead of smart growth, terrible thing. But now that's changing. The gradient is coming like that. Sometimes it's declining in the interior in what we call hollowing out of the city. And at the same time, we're seeing the city density spread all over the place. Los Angeles is no longer surrounded by the traditional suburbia it once was surrounded by, but instead is surrounded by 3 or 4 or 5 outer cities. Big clusters of edge cities. These are new words coming out that people were recognizing the dramatic changes taking place, but they didn't see a sea change. They saw this as a kind of modification of the metropolitan model. Very recently, I've decided that the change is much greater and that we have to recognize a kind of paradigm shift, if you want to use that word, that a new form of urbanization has been emerging. And we see it vividly in Los Angeles, in Washington, D.C., in the Bay Area, not in New York, in the New York metro area. New York metro area is still flat, traditional suburbs. Hardly any of these new outer cities growing, new in the last 40 years around New York. But around Washington, D.C. and Virginia and Maryland, that's all urbanized now, all right? And because it's urban, it's shaping elections in Virginia, shaping elections because it's urban, dominant population. The Bay Area is also experiencing regional urbanization, and Los Angeles is probably more advanced than almost any other place. But one of the things that's happening is that this growth of regional urbanization is bursting boundaries. So we have lots of articles about the metropolis unbound, which is a nice phrase. I like it. And one of the boundaries is the internal boundary between urban and suburban is disappearing. 5 minutes, that's fine. I just want to get to the list of terms. The division between urban and suburban is declining. And you know, we're in Los Angeles. We used to be able very easily to tell whether we lived in suburbs or in the city. In Los Angeles, it's now increasingly difficult. South, what is that suburb? It looks suburban to the easterner. Is it urban? These scholars come from the Brookings Institution, they come to Los Angeles, and they seem to be able to tell what's suburban and what's urban, frequently saying, well, urban is the boundaries of the city of Los Angeles, which includes the San Fernando Valley, which is not urban, and labels as suburban Long Beach with 500,000 people. I mean, it's totally crazy in Los Angeles, but that's part of this regional urbanization process. Now, the other part of unbounding is that the outer boundaries of the city are dissolving, and cities are becoming globalized. The hinterland of Los Angeles, the hinterland of Santa Barbara, in a fullest sense, is global now. That's why urbanization equals globalization. Every major city in the world, its hinterland is now globalized. What happens inside Santa Barbara is affected by Amazonian development and whether McDonald's is finding kangaroos to put into its meat, and all of that other stuff you talk about in global food sources and so on. And what's happening is that it's also creating a new hierarchy of global cities. I'm not interested in that debate, that Sasson, Friedman, world city, global city. The term that's the one I use is city regions, mega regions. That's what the UN uses, because they don't use metropolitan region anymore, because the metropolitan region is no longer relevant. It's the city region, the regional city that we're talking about now. And the biggest mega region in the world recently announced by the UN is the Pearl River Delta, 120 million people. What the heck is that? A massive urban network. Well, what's happening is that these millionaire cities are beginning to dominate the world economy, and I just have some visuals to make you happy a little bit about what happens. These are I'll go back one. The city regions of over 1 million. In 1825, there were two, London and I think Beijing. 1950, they start multiplying. Paris gets added. 1975, Moscow and I don't know, something else, Berlin, I think. And New York, all right? We pop in. That's the 1900. Did I? 1950 start multiplying. Batch in China, batch in Western Europe. 1975, 2000. This is about 350. Today there's probably more than 500. Of the 500 city regions over 1 million, 100 are in China. And probably getting up there in India, but not quite as much. And so this is part of this globalization, global city kind of movement. I just wanted to go on. This is another picture. I'm not going to talk about growth, although it's an interesting picture. And so extended, oh yes, what I'm redefining urbanization as is to connect it more deeply into these urban changes, talking about globalization as extended regional urbanization. This process whereby the cities of the world are spreading themselves out on a global scale. This is what's happened over the last 50 years. It wasn't like that before, as we saw from those maps. Now, globalization and urbanization have become one, together. Part of it is trying to understand this regional urbanization and the urbanization of the world, and the argument that every square inch is now becoming urban, urbanization of the world, the desert, the rainforest. This is, what is this? A fourth urban revolution is a possibility which I avoided in post-metropolis. But now, whether it's we'll never be able to know that, so I just forget about it, whether that's the fourth urban revolution. But I just want to look at this list of new terms. Every urbanist starts inventing a word. I am hoping to make it last for their names forever, give them tenure or whatever, publish in refereed journals. But they're saying the same thing, that suburbs are densifying. And so we have outer cities, edge cities. These are the two ones that are broadly general. But look what else is there. Boom burbs, suburban cores, mini cities, galactic cities, urban galaxies, urban subcenters, superburbia, post-suburbia, technoburbs, technopoles, disturbs, urban villages, suburban downtowns, silicon landscapes, nucleations. Even, as I said, pepperoni pizza city is one. Those are the globs of the cities outside. And the interesting ones are the new ones in East Asia. A lot of new writing about Desakota. And in China, a word that's really powerful in terms of what's happening in China, Chun, which means urban village, village in the city. And the Chinese planners are saying, oh, we expect 250 million people to move into these Chuns. What are they? They're not urban, they're not suburban, they're cities in one level. They can be located anywhere, all right? The French go crazy about peripheral urbanization because they think all of this is happening way out. But it's not. These urban patterns sometimes are happening in the central city, in the middle of it, in the early rings of suburbs, middle rings and outer rings. You know, the rings of suburbs don't have any meaning anymore either because these changes are enormous. And so we just have some conclusions. Basically, they're sort of obvious ones, that a new mode of globalization is emerging that revolves around cities and urban-generated globalization. Other kind, I can't even read this anymore. My neck is no longer typical. Oh yes, this is the other thing, that the kind of regionalized forms of urbanization that existed in the past are weakening as well. Among them, the difference between first world and third world urbanization has not disappeared. All right, I'm not saying that third world urbanization is the same as first world, but the difference between the two is much less than it was 50 years ago. And the idea that there's a North American city or a European city, I don't know, the European city is the compact city and the American city is the sprawl, that's nonsense. Those regional variations have just started falling apart. Why? Because of globalization is evening all of these things out. Globalization has got, as some good scholars have already argued, globalization at one level is homogenizing cities in the world. But that's not the only process. You know, McDonaldization, Coca-Colanization, I don't deny that, that's happening. But at the same time, there's differentiation happening simultaneously. New kinds of things are emerging in different locations. We need good comparative studies because they're so complicated. But our old kinds of models of the city, of globalization, have to be modified and changed because of all of these new developments. And again, more than just, I say, this is just an argument that as we become more of a global hierarchy and network of cities, by the way, when we talk about the urbanization of the world, it's not that the whole world is becoming city-like, but that a network, a mesh, a world wide web of cities is covering every square inch of the world. And therefore, if you're a Maasai in Kenya, who used to have batteries in their earlobes, probably now have cell phones sticking in their earlobe. And they're connected to the whole world, no matter where they are. There's some degree of this urban industrialism that's shaping every square inch on Earth and creating a very different kind of world, because what's also spreading is poverty, inequality. Slums are a characteristic part of these city regions of the world now. We have 2 billion people living in the worst conditions. I think it's much more because in Los Angeles, I think there's probably 800,000 people living in the equivalent of slum housing, but it's not recognized as slum housing. It's overcrowded, it's in backyard garages, it's all over the place. But we need to look for it because of this connection between globalization and urbanization. So I'll end there. Thanks.
while folks gather their thoughts, let me slip in a question myself. You talk about the urban as generative. How about space and features of landscape as generative of the urban? Example, the confluence of rivers, Sumer, Euphrates and Tigris, deltas, the Nile Delta, the delta of the river, the Rhine and the Meuse, enabling the Euro lowlands. Also bays enabling ports, valleys, the Po Valley, etc., etc. And another feature, mountain ranges. How many Asian cities are located so that in the back they have a mountain? Beijing and Seoul rear as a kind of rear protection. So space itself generates certain, and in Feng Shui there is a feng shui of landscaping that works with this in a generative way.
Well, I never use the word landscape, and when I use urban, I'm talking about space. The problem here is that I think you have a physicalist definition of space, and I don't. I don't deny that there are physical aspects of space, but space for me begins with the Lefebvrean idea that space is socially produced. And so every city space is a social product. And sometimes the geographies that we create are oppressive, and so that gets into the spatial justice argument and democracy and intervention. We have to go in and make space better. And this won't make any sense if you think of space as mountains and landscapes and bays and ports. This is the 19th century environmental determinism naivety arguments that has been going on, and people who live in mountain passes tend to be smugglers and thieves. You know, that doesn't help us. It just doesn't work. You have mountains behind Beijing, mountains behind Beirut, mountains behind Los Angeles. I don't know what this is. These physical forms don't determine anything. They shape things. We have to recognize that the details, particularly the kind of differentiation that's going on, is being differentiated because of some certain physical forms, as well as politics and others, creating differences amongst the cities. And sometimes this involves geographical. There's a wonderful article by Paul Krugman. He does a review of the book Nature's Metropolis. What's his name's book on Chicago? I can't remember. What's that? William Cronin. Yeah, Cronin. William Cronin's book on Chicago called Nature's Metropolis. And he does a book review of it, which is online. You can pick it up. And he starts with the argument, nature had nothing to do with it. That Chicago develops not because of nature, but the social construction of Midwestern space and railroads, that there were no local resources, there was no natural port, there was nothing in Chicago to make it the second or third largest city in America, the rapid industrialization of the 19th century. Nature had nothing to do with it. You can talk about physical forms until you go home, until you're exhausted. And it just doesn't have the expected effect. Yeah, it's so tempting. That's why the geographers were so popular in the late 19th century. Ellen Church, and so there's a whole history of this in terms of the kinds of things you're saying, but there's so many exceptions that nothing you said had any general process. Yeah, sorry.
I had a question. First,
Yeah.
I just want to thank you for your talk because you really helped me understand Los Angeles. I grew up in Chicago. But I had a question. You didn't talk a lot about inequality, and towards the end, you put up a list of terms, and I noticed the term slumburbia was missing. And I noticed that around 2008, after the collapse, we started to see that term slumburbia. And in my view, the suburbs were becoming stigmatized, at least in certain language. And I wondered if you could comment on particularly in the Bay Area, there were these suburban communities that weren't predominantly white or Anglo, and went into bankruptcy, and it kind of challenged the traditional definitions of the suburbs.
Oh, everything's challenging.
So I wonder if you could speak
Yeah,
on
yeah.
that.
I mean, two things. One is that the issue of inequality is absolutely central to everything that I've been discussing from the urban restructuring literature that we started with to the regional urbanization literature. Now I'm saying that the growing income gap, the fact that Los Angeles is the most advanced regional urbanization, regional metropolis, is also coincident with the fact that it's got the greatest inequalities of any American city, along with New York. And now, at the time of the '92 riots, the UN argued that the inequalities in Los Angeles were on a scale of Karachi, Calcutta, Mexico City. But unfortunately, in this country, there has emerged from economists and scientists and politicians arguments which drown the importance of inequality, weaken it, and we've got to sweep these things away. We had to wait for something like the beginnings of the Occupy movement for us to realize the gap between the top 1% and 99%. Do you realize just last week, and it was on the decent media like the Daily Show and so on, but the regular media didn't talk about it, but there was a report issued, did you see it, on the global inequalities where they said 85 families had more wealth than the 2 or 3 billion urban poor around the world. 85 families have the same wealth as 3 billion poor people around the world. How could we do this? This is central to everything we do. This should be, like intellectually, the stimulus of urban agglomeration should be everybody's interest. This should be every intervening activist's interest at the moment, how to deal with this terrible inequalities. One of my colleagues last night gave a big lecture, and he ended up with one of the worst, I mean, I just couldn't believe it. It was sleight of hand, although he said some interesting things before then. But he said if we really try to redistribute income, we'll all get poorer. You know, it's stupid, but it's based upon some neoclassical economic logic, a kind of zero-sum game between equity and efficiency.
Well, Bill de Blasio needs your help because that's what he's
Yeah.
using with the Wall Street people in New York.
Oh, it's so powerful.
This out there and they're coming back with, oh, you're going to impoverish all of us. You know.
Yeah, it's really serious, the inequality issues. It's more on the agenda now than it was a couple of years ago, but it still needs to be central. Yes.
Thanks very much. I haven't been thinking about urbanization so much. Oh, okay. So I've been doing field work in a rural area of southeastern China, and when I first started doing field work, it was water
Yunnan?
buffalo.
Yunnan?
No, southeastern.
Southeastern.
Zhejiang
Okay.
province.
Yeah, okay.
Okay, so when I first started doing field work, water buffaloes, chickens, and pigs running around. Just 20-something years later, is just a booming. All the water transport, old ancient water transport canals have been covered over, paved over, and houses, high rises, and so forth. So there's this, what you're saying is definitely playing out in China in a major, stupendous way, just breakneck speed, and that's very dangerous. What I see on the ground there is going on, and what I think is lacking because you're coming at it from a Western capitalist point of view. What I'm trying to emphasize is that places like Sumeria, ancient Egypt, urbanization was not propelled by commercialization. Okay, the ancient capitals, it was state administration was propelling urbanization. So I think this is very important, especially when looking at places like China, because that ancient culture, the ancient drive of the state is still there, very much so, because the state is also the author and a major agency of capital and is the biggest capitalist. Okay, so So what I see here is just when Maoism has declined and there's a political relaxation in the countryside, there's this traditional peasant communalism reemerging. There's the traditional peasant appropriation of space. That is, the earth god emerges. Earth gods have jurisdiction over the local areas. The gods are taken out in ritual processions to the boundaries of the community to demarcate and re-solidify the community sensibility, etc. More, lot more. So now the government, because it's in this mad dash to catch up with the West advanced world and to be, respect itself, because it looks down on this rural stuff, is just, trashing, smashing all this, the past 2 decades of local community rebuilding in an effort to
And what does this have to do with what I said?
Because what's missing in your analysis is the importance of urbanization for state administration. Because when these peasants in rural areas are much more autonomous. They have their communal cultures. When they're brought into the cities, their whole traditional ritualized spatialization is smashed.
Yeah.
When they're stuck in apartment buildings that are very alienating, they come under the authority of state administration. And this is part of the problem of urbanization.
Right.
State administration, governmentality,
and
surveillance
I'm completely in agreement
is
that
much
Sumeria,
easier.
the urban revolution in Sumeria and Mesopotamia was a state, was the creation of the city-state, or the state-city we should have called it, but we didn't, we called it the city-state. And that city-state spread in many other parts of the world, including China. And that state has been a very powerful force. You start exaggerating things drastically in southeast China, all I have to say is Dongguan. Dongguan grows to be 5 to 10 million people without state intervention, without state support, by voluntary village organizations coming together. So, yeah, you're right, the state is a very powerful force. Sovereign capital in China is one of the most dramatic new developments happening. State-based capital is extraordinary. It owns America now. The Fortune 500 now, the top 10, have, 4 or 5 Chinese corporations in there because they control so much capital. And so, yeah, I've been talking about this is the Chinese, the elephant in the room speaks. This is, this is a major area. Now, there is a degree to which one gets knocked out by the fact that maybe 400 to 500 million people were brought out of close to famine into lower middle class life in this process. There's probably 100 to 200 million more in the rural areas. As everyone knows, capitalism in urban industrialization destroys rural areas and rural life. And the question becomes, how do you deal with rural populations in a rapidly urban and industrializing country? This is a major issue. And the Communist Party has